Okay, it's up and running now. It nearly wouldn't work, but we've got it.
Perfect, thank you. Good morning, people in Serbia. Thank you for giving up your morning at Worlds to watch Harish and I talk about strategy. As Geneva said, I think in the Discord chat, we were planning to talk about rebuttal, which sounded much more fun because rebuttal is, in my opinion, by far the most enjoyable bit of debating. But we also have thoughts about strategy, which we will attempt to structure in a way which is useful. And please put comments on Facebook of any questions or anything we can be helpful. Harish?
Yeah, just to start, I did not think it was a workshop on rebuttal. That was just Raffy. But I just want to start with a couple of building blocks in terms of the ways of thinking about strategy. And these sound like things which are very straightforward, but often we don't say them. And when people think of strategy, you think of some of the things you've seen or been told. Talk about breaking deadlocks in the top half, for instance. Talk about filling in gaps which are logically prior to others. And all of those can be useful, but I think it is worth first being very clear about what we mean by strategy and how you can use it. And fundamentally, in any debate, there is one of two disagreements, or both of two disagreements. The first is, what actually should we be aiming to do? Or what kind of effects should we be prioritizing? And the second is, who is more likely to get those potential outcomes? Now, by that I mean, the first step is, what is actually the most important thing, or what are the most important things in a debate? And the second is what we normally consider, which is arguments going back and forth. And every single team is, at least when they are aiming to win, and we'll have a little note of that right at the end, what they are trying to do is to show that their side, their team, is the one which shows that on balance, this side of the motion is correct, and my team has done the most to push you in that direction. And I think the reason why both of these are important to say is it gives us a way of looking at strategically how you are placing yourself in the round. So let's look at the first part of that. What are the actual things we should be prioritizing in any single debate, and how do you clash over them? The first thing I want to note about this is you can have debates where people claim something is bad while the other team is claiming it is good. So let's look at some of the debates that have been going on at Belgrade WUDC thus far. So take round one, for instance. Round one is, just to get the wording out for those of you who don't have it, it is, in disaster-prone areas, this House replace all state rebuilding and reconstruction efforts with a direct cash transfer to affected citizens. And if you're an op, you may be able to create lots of reasons why, without the state being the major actor involved, rather than direct cash transfers, you'll never be able to reconstruct these areas. So what are you aiming for? Reconstruction of these areas. And why? And then you come up with reasons as to why that is more likely, or considerably more likely, once you have state involvement directly rather than direct cash transfers. But there's a very coherent version of the prop, which denies that's your priority at all. Indeed, maybe even argues that is bad. Because what you don't want to do, what you could argue you don't want to do, is get people to stay in the area when it's already disaster prone, where almost irrespective of what mitigation measures you put in place, there is a real risk of human life. And instead, maybe what you want to do is force people, incentivize them to move. That is an illustration as to how, when a team claims something is good, one way of looking at strategy is to say, you spent all this time claiming this is good. You give me all these reasons why it is likely to happen. I don't even need to argue it isn't likely to happen. Indeed, I agree it probably is likely to happen, but what you think is good is actually bad. So that is one way in which you can start thinking about prioritizing effects. And that can be very effective in the top half. It can also potentially be effective in the bottom half, depending, of course, on what your own top half says and whether you're consistent with them or not. So that's the first kind of way in which you can look at how you prioritize effects. The second way in which you can look to prioritize effects is to make a claim about what constituencies actually matter the most. So if we look through the motions again from Belgrade WUDC, let's look, for instance, at prohibit companies from regulating the private behavior of their employees in employment contracts, with lots of examples given. Well, you could argue that this is a policy which helps companies for all kinds of reasons. Let's say, for instance, it prevents dissent, it prevents social media posts which are critical of China, which could be really bad for a company doing a lot of work in China. what's potentially very bad for the employee in terms of the amount of free speech they have, or free expression, or their general freedom to smoke, for instance, given what's in the information slide. Well, both of those arguments may well be true. The question about what we should prioritize is which of these two effects matter the most. And one thing which many debaters do is they'll jump to, well, these harms aren't that significant, or we're just trying to mitigate those harms. And that's fine. And that is certainly a very important part of debating. But if you look at this analytically, maybe the first hoop you want to jump through is, given both of these things are potentially true, which one of these should we prioritize? And the more general one here is we're thinking about which groups should we prioritize? And many people talk about this all the time when it comes to like vulnerable individuals being the groups we got prioritize. Well, that probably requires some weighing, but an explanation as to why that is the group we need to care the absolute most about rather than just state it. But the more general point there is here is another way of talking about what we are actually caring about and what we are trying to do in the debate, or what's the most important thing we can do in the debate. So one is you can claim, which what one team says is good is actually bad, or one team says is bad is actually good. The second is to accept both of these are potential outcomes. Both of these may be good, both of these may be bad, but one of these groups or one of the groups affected matters much more than the other group affected. The third way in which you could do it is ask yourself about scale. And let's take the final motion, which I think perhaps illustrates this in some ways. In times of economic crisis, this House would implement fiscal central banking, i.e., avoiding complications, you are allowing the central bank to dictate the size of the government deficit. Now, if you're on prop, one of your claims will probably be that this policy means that you are more likely to escape or leave an economic crisis better, but here or faster. But here's what to note when a team is weighing that. What are they weighing it against? Because often what a team will explain about the priority is that economic crises are really, really bad. They harm everyone. Fair enough. But that's not necessarily in the burden in the debate. It can be true an economic crisis is really bad. But if you're on the other side, you presumably aren't going to be contesting it unless you're running a very radical line, which is almost certainly not advisable. What you would potentially do is say, okay, let's say this potentially true, maybe even actually true, that the government is more able to end that crisis sooner. The central bank's able to end that crisis sooner. But what is actually the big difference here? If we have slightly larger welfare payments, if you pursue slightly greater spending, which means you don't deal with a debt crisis immediately, you don't reduce inflation as rapidly as you potentially could, we're probably not talking about never ending an economic crisis. Maybe the difference is between 9 months and 12 months. Now, obviously, this is very sensitive to what you're actually claiming about the difference here. But you can say that, yes, we agree that dealing with a crisis is good. We certainly would like to deal with it faster. But if you really think about it, the difference on your side isn't crisis never ends and the crisis ends in 6 months, but it's actually it ends in 6 months or 12 months. And then when we prioritize that against other effects, it potentially is no longer as important as the constituencies which we're talking about on our side of the House. And the reason one just focus on all three of these, and this is not quite an exhaustive list, but I think a reasonable one, which is either you're saying your priority might absolutely be a priority, but in the context of this debate, it isn't as dramatic as you claim. The second one being, there are other things which matter more. This one being what you think is good is bad. Strategically, we're often not thinking in this way. You might come to the same outcomes because that's your intuition, or potentially people have heard it before. But what is intuition in these cases? It's subconscious pattern recognition, that you've seen something like this before, your mind immediately goes there, even if you don't know exactly what your conscious thoughts are. But often, if you're thinking about this step by step, at least have analytically an idea of what prioritization will actually mean and what effects we should prioritize and the different ways we can do it, you're less likely to panic when you hear an argument and you go, we need to weigh this, it's less important than what we're saying, either about the other side or potentially about our own bench as well. And you probably have a quick checklist, which takes you 2 seconds to check through, go, which of these is the one which ends up being the most effective? So that's the first thing we just want to talk about in terms of strategy. What exactly did we mean by it? How exactly can we think about it? And if we can go through that list every time we're in a debate, and indeed in prep as well, you'll often be able to find what are the most effective responses rather just what is a response. And particularly when a team throws something at you didn't expect, you already have a reasonable checklist as to how to push that out on the other side. So that's the first part of strategy I want to talk about, that prioritization. The second part in terms of, are you more likely to get this? Is this impact likely to happen? Now, this isn't normally strategy, right? That's straightforward analysis and content, which is what are our arguments for it? Why are they potentially wrong? What are their arguments for it? Why are they potentially, what are our arguments for it? Why we're right? What are their arguments for it? Why are they wrong? Why are our arguments more important than their arguments in terms of proving this effect? Now, there is one strategic note here, which is actually very important, and actually cross-cuts with rebuttal, I guess somewhat ironically for Raffy here, which is when you are hear an argument, there is a way in which lots of teams respond, which isn't actually a response. By that, I mean, let's say, pick a very straightforward motion. This house would legalize all drugs. And both teams, the proposition makes a claim that you reduce crime. And you reduce crime because these things are no longer illegal. Organized crime no longer is making a lot of money out of it. Fairly straightforward argument. Now, one thing a lot of opposition teams would do there is they go, you're giving me this reason why you reduce crime. Well, how about all the people who are now high on drugs, who need money, aren't working? And here's an entirely different set of reasons why you are increasing crime. Now, if you think about what's actually happening there, you're agreeing on this endpoint, right? That reducing crime is certainly an important goal. The proposition has this set of reasons why you're going to reduce crime. The opposition has this set of reasons why you're going to increase crime. There's actually no rebuttal there, right? You just are talking about the same thing, and you have potentially two sets or multiple sets of arguments which can all simultaneously be true. Now, the thing to realize about that is what lots of teams do. And you should know when you're doing that, which you haven't responded, you're just claiming a parallel effect, a competing effect to the one which you're talking about. And I think the key here is two things, which is once you realize that is happening, you need to weigh why your reasons matter more than their reasons. So why is your claim as to why crime increases more important than their reasons as to why crime decreases? Because no one's responding to anything in this slightly stylized example. And then the question becomes strategically, can you explain why your effects should be prioritized over their effects? And there are many ways in which you could potentially do that. To give you a non-exhaustive list. So you can say a huge number of people are impacted by this, not crime, but by this specific effect, which is a huge number of people are impacted by organized crime, while you'll probably just have pockets of real problems when it comes to people suffering the effects of drugs. Now, of course, you could easily flip that. That's a really concentrated problem. This is a diffuse problem. But that's one way of doing it. How big is the impact and how many people are affected? So that's one potential way of saying this is a larger impact. There are other potential ways of doing so as well. You could talk about, well, look, here's one effect which you're talking about, but the risk reward of it isn't worth it. So it could be the case that you may be correct, we may be correct, but let's compare the two outcomes here. In your world, you reduce crime a little bit. In our world, we increase crime potentially the same amount, but the kind of crime is very different. So it may be bad, for instance, when individuals commit petty crimes because they need to fuel a drug habit, or because you are more likely to drink while intoxicated. And that certainly is a negative effect. But if you're decreasing organized crime, you're potentially preventing much more serious kinds of violence. So if you're doing a comparison of the risks on both sides and the rewards on both sides, one effect may be more powerful than the other. A third kind of way of doing it is, look, both of these are potentially true. Which one is likely to be more of a tipping point? I think people tend to use that a lot. And a final one is perhaps, in your case, the harms are concentrated. In our case, the harms are concentrated, but the benefits are very diffuse. Now you can flip that on both sides. You can have a diffuse benefit, which is actually in magnitude overall much greater compared to a much smaller harm. But the key here, and this is particularly important when you're looking at analytical additions. Now, people call these vertical extensions now, which is you are broadly talking about the same point as your top half. And that will happen to a reasonable degree, in part because if you have a good top half team, they're not missing something really important. You may be able to do each bit of it better, but that isn't obviously going to put you above them unless you're able to give me a reason why your analytical addition as to why this argument is true is so much stronger on yours because of what your contribution is compared to their contribution. So that is which of these effects potentially matters more, and here's why that effect matters more. And it's also a very neat way of doing so, because you don't even have to be overly mean to your top half, which is these guys are right. They talk about this reason why it happens. Well, what we're bringing you is a much more, is another, we stand by them. What we're going to bring you is this reason why it happens. And I want to be clear why this matters more or really makes this argument mean a great deal more or much more plausible. And then explain both the theoretical aspect of it, what you're actually proving, and then going on to prove it. May not in and of itself, depending on the argument, depending on the interactions, be enough to beat that team, but certainly a very good contribution towards it. And when done well, and certainly you can do it several times in a single speech, potentially then becomes enough for you to beat them. There's just one final thing I want to say just broadly on this entire topic, which is if you start thinking about strategy as we need to constantly show why we're doing the most to show why our side of the debate is correct, and you're always thinking about the various mechanisms you have for prioritizing one impact over another, or prioritizing one goal over another, all the ways in which you can potentially do that, that is a first really important bit of strategic framing. And most forms of strategy you've ever heard are implicitly doing this. They're almost always going to go like, here's this big thing you missed because the comparative in the real world. Well, what they're saying is, given the real world, this thing which you are prioritizing isn't actually that big, so we should be prioritizing this other thing instead. And similarly, if you're always looking at effects and you go, well, what are we actually proving on this argument as to why something matters or why something is more true? And why is this actually additive? That can be very powerful. And you see teams try to do this sometimes in a really tortured way, like this deadlock in the top half. Well, they probably just mean there's arguments go back and forth in the top half. But what you can still do there is say, and here's really the most important argument. And the reason why this, the most important reason why something is true is this. You're giving the judge something to hook onto, even when what you're doing is analytically additive. And one final point on all of this, we call this winning strategy. But one thing I think teams sometimes screw up, and maybe this isn't a screw up, but it seems logical to me, particularly in round, that what you're trying to do in every round is obviously win, but really, you don't know that before you are going to speak. You're trying to maximize the expected points you get from a round. And that isn't necessarily the same as trying to make sure you are most likely to win every single round. And this is something to be strategically aware of. Now, consider a case where your top half has covered almost everything. So you have like this small little extension left. The way in which you could beat them is trying to make this small impact really, really large. But you know yourself, it's really hard to weigh against their material. It's probably borderline implausible. And if you try and do that, you're in a very dangerous position. Because sure, you've added something. You probably maximized your chances of beating your top half with a competent judge, but it isn't in and of itself a particularly strong argument. Maybe in those cases, and when you know you're in those cases, and often I think teams do know they're in those cases, you're like, we have nothing much we can add. This doesn't seem very strong. We can't work at how we weigh it or we frame it. It may be best to go, okay, winning is probably, attempting to maximize the chances of winning can be too high a risk. So what we're going to do instead is maximize our chances of taking a second. And just intuitively, if you in the closing are able to rebut absolutely everything off the other side and have even the smallest benefit or harm, you have to come at least second. And sometimes the final bit of strategy here is winning strategy isn't necessarily always going to be the same as maximizing strategy. And keep that in mind, particularly when you're an in round, but actually also particularly when you're in a non-final out round. One of the best things to do is realize there's no difference between coming first and coming second when it comes to what happens to get through this octo final, this quarterfinal. And if you can be aware of that, it can become much easier for you to go, I don't need the winning material, winning strategy. I need the strategy most likely to fit the purposes I want. But those would be my general comments, and I'll hand it over to Raffy now.
Thanks very much, Harish. So I'd just like to add a couple more general comments and then talk briefly about closing half strategy, because I think also that's where strategy is most fun, but also most difficult, because you're trying to assert yourself in the debate when you've already had about half an hour of content coming before you. So just to pick up on something Harish said, and I think you can't emphasize this enough, which is that judging debates is a nightmare. You as a judge are sitting there, you have people talking quite intelligently about a subject for roughly an hour, and then you have to place them in an order and make at least half of them sad and two of them extremely sad. And you're sitting there thinking, well, what is my justification for doing so? And in debates, there's a lot of elements which are kind of thrown at you as a judge. So if you as a team can articulate a plausible rationale for why you should be given the win, that's very easy for the judge to latch onto, to use it to explain to their panel, to convince themselves. So I think for me, that's ultimately what strategy is. It's helping the judge to understand why your arguments win the debate and why the rebuttal and points of analysis that you're saying is important, and not having too much confidence in the judge's ability to do it rightly themselves, because the judge is a student just like you who kind of needs your assistance to see the debate clearly, and you can have the opportunity to do that by kind of writing their summary of why you've won for them. So the second thing I would say, which is quite related to that, is that ultimately all debating is about time allocation. You're given an enormous topic which you could write a book on or kind of talk about for literally hours, and you have to talk about it for just 7 minutes in a fairly concise way which interacts sensibly with the other teams. And I think very much the temptation is to spend your time on what you think is kind of interesting, or an argument you think is particularly fun, or attacking something particularly stupid the other side said. But for me, the essence of strategy is recognizing that in your 7 minutes, there's incredibly little that you can actually do, and that you need to allocate that correctly. And I think that becomes especially important, as I'll get onto in the second half of the debate, where just so much has happened. There's so many things you can rebut. You don't have time to interact with all of them. You need to make sure that you're allocating your time to the things which are actually important, rather than to the things which are just easy or fun to spend your time on in the debate. So kind of linked to that, a third thought is that you cannot go into every individual claim which someone has made and rebut it. And if you do that, then obviously you kind of waste your time and you don't have time for any substantive material. But on the other hand, I think most people are far too accepting of claims which other people have made, which are unintuitive. So I think the strategy of rebuttal has to be about allocating your time, as Harish says, to the elements of someone else's case which are actually worth interacting with, which means evaluating what is strategically plausible for the judge as an identification for when it wins. Just two more general thoughts. The first one is, I don't think most people take nearly enough advantage of being open in government and having the model. As open in government, you have the opportunity to decide what the motion actually means and to determine, therefore, kind of the territory you're going to be fighting on. And it's the most beautiful opportunity to rig the debate by excluding things which are unhelpful to you, if you can do that within the fair definition of modeling, or alternatively by adding lots of things to make sure that something is going to be interpreted judiciously if it's a policy debate, or explaining the meaning in a way which is suitable for you if it's an analytical debate. And I think people often think of, well, we need to have a model and then just kind of write something quickly and get on with the serious business of arguing. But I think people need to build their case first, think about what the key weaknesses are in it, and then use the model in a strategically aware way to mitigate whatever weaknesses are available. And I think the excitement to be able to make a model is to just be able to rig the debate slightly, which people need to be more aggressive in taking advantage of, in my experience. And the final point, as a general thought, is on kind of analytical knifing when you're in closing half. Which I think, many years ago at the beginning of debating, in about 2010, when Harish was a youth, it was not permissible at all to criticize the team which had gone before you. But this has become increasingly, as long as you're not saying they're wrong, if you're saying that their analysis is not up to standards, I think there's an increasing kind of consensus that that's acceptable, and it's become more and more fashionable to do. So as a closing half team, I think you can have no shame in saying, well, of course, there's a bit of an analytical gap here, and it feels very unnatural and uncomfortable to be criticizing your own side, but I think it's worth thinking about how you can position yourself versus the opening half team by illustrating what are the question marks over their analysis without being too aggressive about it, such that you're rebutting them. And one way you can do that, which I think is really elegant, is to point out that the other side has made cogent rebuttals, or to make the other side's rebuttals slightly more cogent than they actually were, and then to say, we love this argument, we're very persuaded by it, but unfortunately the nasty people in opposition had this effectual rebuttal, and therefore you might have doubt about it. And it's a fair question that the opposition's asking. Yes, indeed, maybe there is a kind of analytical gap there. And I think if you're thinking about how to position yourself in closing half, that I think is one of the key things for asserting yourself in an effective, in a debate where others have been relatively good. So just slightly more specific thoughts on closing half strategy. The BP debating is decidedly weird. Whenever I try and explain it to anyone who hasn't done a lot of debating, they rapidly become bored and confused. I think because the closing half is so unnatural to people that you're competing against the team that's gone before you. And I know that everyone knows the basics of extension and summary speeches. You just have to have new material to whip the extension, etc. But I think it cannot be emphasized enough that in closing half, you do not win by rebuttal, or you don't win by kind of framing. You have to win by having something which is plausibly new material. And as Harish said, that can be analytical or vertical extensions, or it can be having something which is actually big and new. I think as a whole, analytical extensions are very high risk strategy. Because the better the debates get, the more risk is that actually what you're saying is quite similar to what another team's gone before, and that maybe it comes up at the last minute of the Deputy Prime Minister's speech. quite quickly, and then you're reluctant to abandon it. So I think people end up tricking themselves into thinking that what they're saying is new, when actually it's quite similar to what's gone before. So I think you do, by and large, want to be looking for a genuinely new area and kind of expanding on that if at all possible. The point I would note about strategy of extension speeches and time allocation is you often see extension speakers doing 3.5, 4 minutes, 4.5 minutes rebuttal. But fundamentally, as an extension speaker, you are never going to win by the quality of your rebuttal, or you are unlikely to do so. Leave it to your summary speaker. Just do it quickly at the beginning, and then allocate your time to the extension, which I think is strategically where you're reaping overwhelmingly the most rewards from your time allocation. And that similarly with the summary speech, I think you cannot emphasize enough, even though it's a really obvious point, it's nonetheless, you just have to keep it in your mind every single time, that your job is to explain why your partner has already won. And that, I say this as an extension speaker, I love extension speeches, they're really fun. But the extension speech is the most irrelevant speech in the debate by some distance, because if your partner has not said anything, sorry, the summary speech is the most irrelevant speech in the debate by some distance. If your partner has not said anything in the extension speech, you have lost already, and there is nothing as an extension speaker that you can do to change that. And conversely, if their extension has been truly fantastic, you're quite well placed to win already. And as a summary speaker, there's kind of only a limited amount of damage which you could do if there's already been a great extension. So all your thought in the summary speech has to be not how do I make a smashing speech for myself? It's about how you position what your partner has already done in the debate. And everything you're doing, I guess, has to be built around that. And ultimately, therefore, rebuttal is good in a summary speech, but it needs to be focused on how things are interacting with your partner's extension. You might need to hit some of the key points which the other side has said, especially if they haven't been hit before, although that's kind of a problem if they're coming up for the first time in the summary speech. But mainly what you need to do is defend your partner's material from any attacks there have been, and hit any lines from the other side which specifically interact with it. So as a summary speaker, you're sitting there writing down everything which the other side has said and kind of thinking, oh, what's a response to it? What's a response to it? So you end up with this massive page of responses. But I think you need to be disciplined about discarding 85% of them and just sticking with a couple of ones which are really relevant to your partner's material and your partner's positioning in the debate. And I would say a couple of other things on that. The first one is you need to be listening to the extension speech and essentially thinking, what has my partner done wrong here? What are the kind of strategic risks and strategic problems for us? Is there an analytical weakness? Have they not explained the framing properly? So your job is to be a kind of friendly critic of your partner, and then to catch any mistakes they've made and to try and make the judge forget about mistakes and kind of hush up anything which has gone wrong in the extension speech. And I'd say there's really two ways you could be very useful there. The first is to situate it within the context of the debate and to explain how your partner's material interacts with the other points of kind of rebuttal and analysis which have come out, and therefore why it is most important and wins. So your kind of tour of the debate, which you're giving in your summary speech, is only in order to provide a kind of a nice wrapping paper for your partner's extension, which is really the thing the judge ought to be excited about. And the second one is what to do if there's been analytical weakness in your partner's extension speech. They haven't quite got to the material, they did something wrong, you think it's not quite developed enough. This, I think, is overwhelmingly the hardest part of being a summary speaker, because technically there's nothing that you could do about that. You can just kind of try and sneakily put in more analysis and hope the judge doesn't notice that it was primarily in the summary speech, not in the extension speech. That does sometimes work, so it's worth trying. But I think what tends to work better is if you frame it around the responses that have been from the other side. So my partner made this claim. Here's the response we've had from closing opposition whip. actually, it's quite a good response. I understand that it kind of attacks my partner's analysis effectively. Here are the 5 reasons why I think it's wrong. And then you can add the strategic logic, but because it's sort of counter-rebuttal, that is more legitimate than if you were just to say, and here are the 5 additional points of analysis that I'm going to raise in my partner's speech. Or I'm going to add to what my partner's already said. So I think it's a good way of kind of forcing in the additional material if there's anything which has been wrong. Hope that makes sense on summary speeches. But I think basic as it is, you can't emphasize enough that summary speeches are just an opportunity to explain why you've already won, past tense. I think we were going to take questions if there have been any, or if there's anything which would be useful for us to discuss. So, question on strategic POIs as OG to CO. Given CO team is really strong and runs several good extensions, how do you as OG strategically craft a POI, given that they're likely to only take one in their speech? Do you ask a POI bring your case into light, which may be less relevant by closing half? Or do you ask a refutional POI to their extension, in which case, how do you prioritize which part of their case to attack?
I don't know if there's a general answer to this, in that it sounds to me that's very context dependent. So the first thing I would just note about that is, do you think they are beating you? Do you think there is anything you can reasonably do with a competent judge to deal with these problems? And the answer may well be no. So think about it this way, which is, you realize they have 3 good extensions. At absolute best, in 15 seconds, you are hitting 1. 2 of the other ones are still going to succeed. Those 2 will still, on balance, beat the case which you presented. So attacking 1 is good. You're adding something to the debate, but you're not actually switching the call. Maybe your worry here is they're probably winning. So what I need to do is make sure we come second. What I think you can then potentially do is push what you have actually said. Say, look, we brought you this. This has never been responded to, and it's really important for this reason. It might well then be the best decision to make, but probably will just put you in a second. It may well not give you a first, or potentially the argument really is that important and no one touched it well. But I do think this is very context dependent.
So I think POIs are actually very much about perception, that you need to be perceived to be being responsive and interacting with the other teams in the debate. So for me, if you have a really clever POI, which takes out even 1 line of their analysis, even if that should not kind of win you the debate as such, because it doesn't knock something out, it's useful to have said something clever to closing half, which they might not be able to respond to, and it will improve the judge's perception of you vis-a-vis them. So I think that's definitely worth doing if it's good enough. I think, you know, candidly, if their extension's actually good, it's quite unlikely you can knock it out with a POI. But if you have something clever, I would say it in order to make the judge remember that you're also intelligent.
I feel this always just highlights Raffy. I actually think we have the same perception. Raffy's just a bit more blatant about it. Many judges are not paying lots of attention. Many judges are not very good. How do you play with their perception rather than how do you win the debate? Again, depends a bit about who your judge is, though I guess you potentially don't know that.
Yeah, to be honest, the more and more debating I've done, the more disillusioned I've become with the quality of judging and the way that you can play with the judges. So I would recommend some degree of cynicism about that. Sorry. Could you maybe go a bit into using the model as an OG to your advantage? How to do it? Maybe a few examples. So I think in essence that a model, but if a policy is debate, it's almost definitely something which hasn't been done. And if it's something which hasn't been done, there are probably strong reasons, like most people find it to be kind of intuitively dangerous. or there are kind of risks attached to it. And those are probably actually going to be fairly obvious, because once you've done a reasonable amount of debating, you just kind of get an intuition for what the other side's arguments are. So I think it's the opportunity to then take out some of the other side's arguments by putting in features which help to mitigate them. So the motion in disaster-prone areas, this House would replace all state rebuilding and reconstruction with direct cash transfers to affected citizens. So I suppose that the opposition is going to say something like, well, this might not be enough for them to rebuild their homes properly or for them to have a new life. Or alternatively, they'll say something like, well, they'll just spend all the money immediately and then they won't have anything left afterwards. So if you're building the model, you could say, well, firstly, it's going to be a very large sum of money, so we'll make sure that it's adequate for their needs. And secondly, that we're going to pay it in installments so that people can't spend it all at once. We're going to have effective counter-fraud measures in order to kind of prevent the money from being stolen. And I think maybe this also goes slightly to the perception point, which is, the judge is sitting there and they're about to hear the debate. You stand out with a model which sounds actually detailed and like a sensible policy proposition of how this might actually work. That's really useful for them, thinking that you're serious and that you have you've thought about how this is going to actually function and interact in the debate. So again, for the perception management.
Yeah, I guess when it comes to OG models, so one is to be very concrete, but actually sometimes being very vague, but strategically vague can be really useful.
Concrete, but actually be vague, I think.
Yes, it's the whole, look, there are several things we can do. This. We're not going to specify which. That's going to depend on the countries and on circumstances. Here's roughly the process we're going to put in place. And it doesn't actually give them anything easy for them to focus on an attack. It's like, yeah, obviously we're not doing that in that case. That's just absurd. This is why we said this and this as well. And it can be so frustrating for the other team because you sound so concrete, but they don't know what to attack.
Yeah, this is a kind of moving target model, which is beautiful. In terms of prioritizing effects, when the arguments for your side are more micro or have a very concentrated effect, i.e. arguments on the benefits for the individual or personal liberties, how do you make this more winning versus a macro case? So in essence, I suppose if it's affecting a small group of people, there have to be reasons to care about that group specifically, as opposed to the overall reasons. And that the kind of standard debating answer is to highlight that they're a particularly vulnerable identitarian group and that therefore people should be sympathetic to them, which is a perfectly good piece of framing, but people do tend to wheel it out in circumstances where it's not necessarily applicable. So that's definitely one thing you can do.
I mean, the other one, which I guess your example is driving at, is when it seems to be an impact, which is more of a principal claim, which is you shouldn't take the rights away from these group of people who use them quite well for larger social ramifications. And, the traditional answer is people use a line like, this is non-utilitarian, that this is not contingent on the practical claims, which I think is actually maybe true, but it's actually a very bad way of explaining what you actually mean. And I think what you want to say in those cases, you want to give me reasons why these individual rights or these individual things are things the state should never take away, except maybe in the most extreme circumstances. You could talk about things like due process, rule utilitarian, but you want to give a little bit more bite if this ends up being a major part of your case, which is the principle is huge, it outweighs these practical impacts, including all of society gaining something from this. You need to give me a reason why this should be prioritized, which could be on a rule basis, the state should not take away these rights. Who is making these individual decisions, more than just jumping into the whole, this is a principle in and of itself. But again, this is a little bit of those, like most of these, it's a little bit hard to answer in the abstract, but that will probably be one of the other ways I would look at it. So either explain why the group matters or why this effect really matters. It's probably a principle or right, but you need to go more than just say it is a principle or right.
So the question in essence, which we've got is, what do you do if you have lots of rebuttal in closing, but you don't have an extension? And how do you frame your rebuttal as an extension? And do you just have a kind of shallow extension for the sake of saying you have an extension, but spend 5 minutes on rebuttal? I think I'd be interested to hear Harish on this, but I think that if you do that, you're likely to lose, and that what you need to do is to reconstitute all your rebuttal as an extension, given that the difference between substantive and attacking material is basically arbitrary anyway, and then use that extension to win. And substantive material can be responsive, but you just need to frame it as substantive material rather than framing it as purely responsive.
Yeah, so let's start with the basic here, which is, if you are not adding anything new, you are unlikely to do very well in the debate. But new material can both be what we call constructive, or it can be responsive. Every team is trying to show that their team is doing the most to show on balance their side of the debate is correct. If you are able to show the other side has no harms or no benefits, you are doing a fairly large job to showing your side of the debate is correct. Now, that isn't really enough, because you need to show at least a marginal harm or marginal benefit on your side. And odds are the top half team in this case did so instead. Now, there are two approaches to this. This, I think Raffy's entirely right on the perceptional level, which is when I said you can just be entirely responsive, almost entirely responsive, entirely true, but the question is, how do you frame that for maximum effect? Which is, these are the core questions in this debate. Let's talk about each one of these. And you can label them as extensions or not, but if you do, it's slightly more likely no judge is going to say you didn't have an extension. It is true, irrespective of how you frame it, you have lots of new material which should be weighed, but the risk minimization strategy is to make it sound like that is additive. So a good judge probably realizes it isn't, or it realizes it isn't actually adding a new reason why this is really bad or really good, but nonetheless, that can still be additive. But let's say we're talking about the extreme version of this, which is you can rebut everything the other side says, but at the end of your speech, it is neutral, i.e. they have no benefit or they have no harm, but you have no benefit and no harm. And that's a really tortured version of this, right? Because normally when you're attacking an argument, you don't just take it to neutral, you're taking it at least somewhat to your side. Often, if that is the case, point that out explicitly. But if that isn't the case, sure, have a 1.5 to 2 minutes in your partner's speech, which is entirely new, which you could frame as news for these other effects. But that gets you the second, probably. But that isn't necessarily the worst position to be in. Indeed, there are definitely two worst positions you could be in most debates. Raffy, you were saying something. Yep.
No, I think just coming in on one point you made, which I think was really good, is judges are looking for an excuse in closing to say that you don't have an extension. Haha, you've got the third. Nice and easy for me to justify and to explain. So you just do not want to give them any form of opening whatsoever to claim that you don't have an extension, because it kind of, even if you've actually got new material there, semantically not framing everything as an extension presents an unacceptable degree of risk of making it too easy for the judge to not give you one of the higher points. In many ways, the more that you don't have an extension, the more you have to use the word extension, and to kind of make sure that you're presenting everything as ultra new, if that makes sense. Geneva said this was the last question. Thanks very much for listening. We very much hope that made sense and was useful. Harish's bit definitely did, and was characteristically effective. And best of luck in